My name is Audrey.
My name is Gonzalo.
I'm Lisette.
Charles. My name is Jonathan.
And I'm Bradley.
And today we will be sharing with you our 5 most important recommendations for designing your visuals. So, I have a confession, and it's a little bit embarrassing, but one of my biggest fears is going to the bathroom and there being a murderer or someone hiding behind the shower curtain. So I absolutely cannot go to the bathroom without pulling back the shower curtain and making sure that there's no one there. So I don't know if anybody can relate to this fear or if you're just sitting there like, this girl is crazy, but maybe this is a fear that some more of you can relate to. Does anybody know what one of the most common fears held by people is? Does anyone want to guess? Just shout it out.
Public speaking.
There you go. That's exactly right. It's public speaking. So a study by Dr. Jeffrey Strawn, who is a professor and psychiatrist at the University of Cincinnati, reported that up to 75% of people share a fear of public speaking. And that can range from mild nervousness before you present to having a full-blown panic attack. He goes on to explain that one of the best methods for overcoming this fear is exposure, to practice public speaking as much as you can. And one of the first steps to doing that is creating a presentation that you can feel confident about presenting to your audience that helps portray your message in the best way possible. So if anybody in the audience here today can relate to that fear of public speaking, hopefully today we'll be able to share some steps with you that will help you to craft a visual aid that will help you feel confident when presenting. So the video I'm about to show you is just going to set the tone for how scary it can be when you don't do a good job of designing your PowerPoint presentation.
We have some sound issues.
Sorry about that, y'all. Seems like we're having some audio issues, so we're going to see if we can get the sound to work for you. Okay, sorry about that. Basically that presentation just showed you some bad examples of what to put in your PowerPoint presentation, and not to worry, we're going to go through all of them and give you examples of that during our presentation. Some examples are pixelated images, fonts that are difficult to read, all things that are going to distract from the message that you're trying to deliver to your audience. So to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today, first I'm going to explain how we're going to set up our recommendations throughout the PowerPoint, and then the rest of my team is going to walk you through our SCARE method, which is selecting meaningful titles, creating a message, applying visual effects, reinforcing with graphics, and editing your efforts. And then I'm going to go ahead and review these recommendations for you and open the floor to questions. So here you'll see we have a tracker at the top of our slide that's going to tell you where we are in our presentation for each recommendation we have. The heroes and weapons you see here are going to be the right thing to do when building your visual aid and tools to help you do it. The monsters and traps are going to be examples of what not to do when creating your visual aid and common mistakes that you might make. And now I'm going to pass it off to Gonzalo, who will tell you about selecting meaningful titles.
Thank you, Audrey. So for our first recommendation, we want you to make sure that you are going to direct the audience attention during your presentation. And one of the best weapons for this is selecting contrasting colors. That will help you to put the focus on what you want to say, instead of allowing the audience to just guess what is the important part of your message. Also, it will help you to reconnect with audience members that because they are arriving late or they just had a secondary thought, they just disconnected with what you were saying. The second recommendation is that to prefer meaningful titles that summarizes the key information on your slide. This is especially useful considering secondary audience members, and Russian presentations where you need a quick high-level view to save time. Catching an informative title helps you to reinforce the attention and the interest in the message. The third one is to organize main ideas. And the best way to accomplish this is the use of a storyboard. Even with only the titles, the audience should be able to follow the structure of the story you are building with your presentation. And this, using the storyboard, can help you to keep track with the visual pattern you've set up. Talking about patterns, the fourth hero you want to use is keep a visual rhythm. This is the use of a constant pattern. This is defined by the college, by C.S. Chan, a professor of the College of Design at Iowa State University, in his article, Phenomenology of Rhythm in Design, as the regular regular harmonious recurrence of a specific element, which can be shape, form, line, color, or like a shadows combinations. Pretty much like in music, the same recurrence for long periods of time will become boring and hard to follow. You can use the same concept of silence in your visual presentations as we did before, with just a blank slide to put the attention on what you're saying or what's coming next. So we want you to make sure to use those parallelisms. On the next slide, we want you to show the monsters and the common traps that can lure regarding the use of titles. The first one is use misleading titles, especially those that present an unrelated idea to what you really want to talk about. This can confuse the audience members and confuse your audience to generate the wrong idea about what you want to say. This is especially troublesome for when you're presenting based on your own personal experience and your own personal background as an expert. The audience will consider that you're underprepared and will lose trust on what you're saying. The second mistake that is very common is use lengthy titles, especially if they go over a one line. This can create confusion and also can generate the idea in the worst case scenario that you have something to hide, using convoluted titles that can confuse and shadow what you really want to say. The other extreme, it's also a mistake. Being too simple, especially relating to one word only for your title, it doesn't provide any meaning to the audience. Titles that fall into being too simple can also confuse the presenter, especially in those cases for big corporative presentations that the person who is doing the speech is not the one that prepared the slide. Finally, the most common mistake of all, choosing non-descriptive titles. Using generic titles that doesn't say anything valuable at all lose all the strength that a good, meaningful title has in your presentations. But also, it gives you the need to put more text in your slide, so a meaningful title will not only help you to keep track of the presentation, but also it will save you space on your slide, making it look more clean. Now, as two examples to show you how this works, we have a direct title for the American Werewolf in London movie, where, as you can guess, a backpack traveler in London from America is bitten by a werewolf and becomes the monster himself. In contrast, we have The Silence of the Lambs. Who doesn't know this movie? This movie is actually about a FBI trainee who uses the help from a cannibal who is in prison to catch another serial killer. Absolutely guaranteed, 0 lambs shows up in this movie. But being a catchful title for a movie, for your presentation, this will be very troublesome. And now, we want you to try for yourself how to make this work with meaningful titles. So we have 2 movies here. Both of them, we hope you recognize them. The first one is Child's Play. And in your notes, please, I want you to try to create a more meaningful title based on the following plot summary. A dying murderer uses black magic to put his soul inside a doll named Chucky. A mom buys the doll for her son, and Chucky goes on a murdering spree. Please take 30 seconds, try to summarize and put a better title that can overall englobes this concept.
Sorry? Oh, you can work with the group. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for trying. Now let's make a second try. It. The movie description is this. A group of valiant kids band together to destroy a shape-shifting monster, which disguises itself as a clown and preys on the children of Derry, a small town in Maine. Take 30 seconds.
Are we sharing our answers?
Yeah. Thank you. So, to summarize, with this activity, we want you to give you experience how actually putting a meaningful title on your presentation is an active cognitive experience. It's harder just to think about something that englobates a whole concept into just one line, right? So, do you have any examples you want to share about any of the movies?
For Child's Play, Kill Me.
Okay, that's a good one.
Play with me.
Play with me? Okay.
For Kid to be one-man circus.
That's a good one, actually. So, thank you for participating. We have other three more points to present you today. And now I want you to give you Lisette, who will talk our next recommendation for you.
Thank you, Gonzalo, for reviewing the do's and don'ts of our first recommendation, which is select your titles. I will now go over our second recommendation, which is create a message. So for heroes, again, things that we want to do, we want to organize our ideas to be able to create our message. The best way to do that is by designing a template. So think about it as if you're writing a paper. When you're writing a paper, you're creating your outline before you're writing that paper. So the template will help organize your ideas so that way you're effectively relaying that message. You also want to emphasize your main message, and a good way to emphasize your main message is by making your points relevant and concise. So by creating that outline, you'll be able to take away the fluff that doesn't relate to the message or won't help emphasize what you're trying to relate to the audience. Also, you want to establish your text structure, and that's just basically organizing what you are, the message that you're going to get. A good way to establish your text structure is by using parallel structure. So for example, with our schema here, we're using heroes, and then we're also talking about weapons. So weapons are tasks or things that will help us with our to-dos. And then you also want to tell your story. So your story should have elements of a theme, just like the presentation here and everybody else's presentations before us and after us. We're using a unifying theme. We decided to go with the horror theme to help explain and bring our message across. So monsters are things that you want to avoid. You want to avoid overwhelming people with information. So a trap that people fall into is using too many words. By a show of hands, has anybody ever had a conversation with someone and you just got lost in what they were saying? You totally forgot what you guys were talking about.
When I talk.
Yeah.
My boyfriend.
Right? So I was actually talking to my mom the other night, and she's on this trip. She went to Washington, and it's her first, I called it a religious seminar. And I asked her, I was like, so what is it? Is it a seminar or a class that you guys are taking each day? And she started rambling on about how it's not called religion and the reason why they don't call it religion. And literally it lasted like 5 minutes. I totally forgot what we were talking about and what I had asked her. And then at the end she was like, oh yeah, so to answer your question, I was like, oh, okay, that's what we were talking about. So avoid doing that to people, especially in a presentation. People are going to stop paying attention if you're overwhelming them with information. And that leads into getting lost in the details. So there's some information that is not relevant to your message, and you want to avoid sharing that information. Including long lines of text, that's another thing that you want to avoid. So like Gonzalo was saying earlier, if you have a line that just leads into the next line and that second line is only one word, it's confusing people and your message won't get across properly. And then misleading the audience is another thing that you want to avoid. So you want to make sure that you're giving an informative presentation. You want to be concise with your wording and avoid using indirect phrasing. So for example, if we were to use a bullet point and we wanted to say, we wanted to use a bullet point, getting lost in the details, if you just put getting lost on the bullet point there and somebody saw it, it doesn't stand alone, so they wouldn't really understand what the message is that you're trying to portray to them. We're going to do an activity here. So I'm going to read a description of a movie. And then we are going to try to guess as a group what that movie is. And then afterward, we'll talk about a better description that we could have used to name this, or to describe this movie. So this first movie is: a wisecracking boiler technician teaches high school students to believe in their dreams. Can anyone guess what movie this is? Yes?
It's A Nightmare on Elm Street.
You must have seen the movie then. So, is anybody familiar with this movie? No? Yes? It's part of the Freddy Krueger series. So a better way to describe this movie could have been: teenagers fall prey to Freddy Krueger, a disfigured midnight mangler who preys on the teenagers in their dreams, which in turn kills them in reality. So if you look at the description that they gave, it kind of makes it seem like there's a technician who's actually encouraging teenagers and maybe helping them, I don't know, aspire to their dreams. So you don't, but just by reading that description, it doesn't seem scary at all. So you would have never known that he was out to kill these kids. Okay, our second movie is: a reclusive weirdo and his mutant employees lure children into his factory with sweets, then dispose of them one by one. Anyone guess?
Charlie Chocolate Factory.
Yes. So this one obviously has the opposite effect. By the description that was given, it actually seems like a scary horror movie, when in fact it was a comedic fantasy movie. So it's really important to make sure that you are using the right words and that your description matches the message that you're trying to relay. All right, now I'm going to pass it on to Charles for our third recommendation.
Thank you. So our first hero in this recommendation is to create a unifying theme. And one of the ways we can do that is by establishing a color theme. And this just helps to stay consistent with the theme that you're trying to connect with your message. And it also emphasizes and amplifies the theme that you're portraying as well. Our next one is to enhance the readability. We obviously want our audience to be able to read what's on the screen. And to do that, we should stick to simple and large fonts. We don't want anything too complicated. I found a few complicated looking fonts that I'd never seen before. It took me a minute to actually read them. One of them was Lobster, and another one was Pacifico. I'd never heard of them before. I'm sure you haven't either, but it was Scribble. And our next hero is to keep backgrounds simple. We want to use solid colors so that the foreground of what we're trying to present pops out more than the background. We don't want the background to be the focus on what we're trying to portray here. We suggest that you use solid colors. we chose a black solid color so that the contrast between the brightness of our foreground and the darkness of our background stands out even more. I'm sure when you're looking at this slide, your eyes are drawn towards these two boxes rather than these black area out here. And our next hero here is to signal content changes. I'm sure you've noticed that the heroes and the monsters are different colors, as well as the weapons and tools. And we did that on purpose. We want to make sure that because there's a difference in the, we want to, if you see something different, we want to make sure that you know that something other than the information, what you're being presented, is different from the information from the previous slides. So to do that, you can establish a visual pattern, and our visual pattern was the different color schemes for our heroes and monsters. As for our monsters, our first one is having hard to see visuals. We don't want anything that the audience can't see, obviously, and using busy backgrounds is one way to keep the audience's attention astray from what we want them to focus on. We were first thinking about having like the dark forest as a background as opposed to this black canvas, but we decided that people would probably be looking at the forest instead of what we want them to look at. Our next monster is distracting from the message and using too many different fonts. You should have it like 2 or 3 at the most for different things, but no more than that. The different fonts distract the audience, and it signals that if they see too many different fonts, they're going to get distracted and probably lose focus because they don't know what to focus on. And then our next monster is shouting at your audience. And what I mean by this is, you know how in your text and texting somebody and use all caps, it means you're shouting at someone typically. So there's no need to use capital letters. They're not going to remember it more just because you shouted it at them with the text on the screen. So it's kind of redundant. And our last monster here is making a confusing format. We don't want any confusing formats. We want it to stay consistent throughout the entire presentation, and using an inconsistent layout is one way that people fall to or die to this monster here. Basically, if you use the heroes and tools that I was talking about on the previous slide, you shouldn't have a problem with this last monster here. So as long as you stay consistent with the slides and you use a schema to your presentation, you shouldn't have too much of an issue. This is just an example of how people today use green screens, or you can also use blue screens, those 2 dots, to apply visual effects in movies today. This movie is Hollow Man. It was made in 2000. It's about a guy who gets like injected with some serum, and he turns invisible, and he causes mayhem around town. Everybody's just trying to kill him because he turned bad. And now we're going to move on to our activity, and I'm going to ask for a few volunteers to, 1, give me their name when they volunteer, and 2, help me figure out what went wrong when I was designing this slide. Have any volunteers? Yes, what's your name?
Okay, my name is Kushbu,
Thank you,
and
Kushbu.
I guess like something that I see wrong is that the font color and the background of where the font is like from the same family of blue colors, so it makes it hard to read what it actually says.
I believe it's actually blue and green.
Oh, okay. It
Right.
just looks like
Yeah,
the
it
sky
looks
blue,
really
but
hard
yeah,
to see.
still same like
Definitely.
family.
Yes.
Jennifer, and
Hey,
I'm
Jennifer.
going to kind of play off what she's saying, because in the activities, like visual effects, the effects is actually in the white, so it just kind of blends
Mhm.
together. And
Yes.
then the little, what is that thing called?
This?
Yes.
The tractor?
The tracker.
Yeah, for sure. Any others? Yes.
Kenny.
Ken, thank you.
The fonts, they're all over the place. The activity has a different font than the rest.
Oh, right, you are. Yes.
Barzik, the blue text box doesn't really go well with the rest of the slide in black and white. It doesn't play well with the theme.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of things wrong with this here. Inconsistent layouts, too many fonts. The background is very distracting. You don't know whether to look at this vampire coming through the door or the giant blue block of or blue text box that's covering up an eighth of the screen. All in all, you want to stay consistent with the slides that we've seen previously and not show anything that's too out of order. Now we're going to pass it to Jonathan, who will tell us about our next recommendation.
All right. So, thank you. Thank you, Charles. This is our fourth recommendation of Scare. This is going to be reinforced with graphics. So, our first hero is going to be to use relevant photos. And the weapon is going to be to choose standalone images. So if you want to have a relevant photo, you want to make sure that your photo is related to what you're speaking about. So if I'm speaking about heroes, then here we have this muscly arm that's supposed to represent a hero. So as I talk about the text here, the picture shows you what I'm relating to. So choosing standalone images will make sure that what you're speaking about is exact and it's related to your text. Now moving on from there, our next hero is to position graphics carefully. And this is because we want your audience's attention to be kept. You want to make sure your audience is looking where you want them to look. And this is by drawing their attention, like we have with the white text boxes, on the black background. It's much easier to just focus on the text when the background is out of the way. Our next hero is to deliver readable statistics. This is easily accomplished by using graphs and charts. When you're using graphs and charts, you do want to make sure that you have things legible. Having statistics that nobody can read makes the charts and graphs just useless. So you certainly don't want to have that. Moving from there, we're going to have illustrating relationships and flow. And this is most easily broken down by explaining that you want to be using diagrams when you're explaining complex subjects. So a more simple diagram would be a Venn diagram. Most people are familiar with the two circles of the Venn diagram. You have two different objects or whatever it may be, and then you're comparing what's in the middle. So by having these sort of diagrams break down what your content is, you're breaking it into much more manageable pieces for your audience. All right, moving on from there, we are going to be looking at our monsters and traps. Our first monster is confusing with pictures. So the trap here is applying unrelated images. If you have images in your presentation that just have nothing to do with your presentation, you're certainly going to confuse somebody. If they're trying to draw lines that aren't really there, they're just going to end up wasting their time and not listening to what you're talking about. The next monster that we have is altering photos incorrectly. And a big thing that has come recently from this is Photoshop. If you're making your photo like larger than life or just unrealistic, then you're actually just lying to your audience, especially, I don't want to go into supermodels and all that, but I guess that's on that topic. So yeah, stretching or cutting off the edges of images is certainly going to be a problem. You don't want to have it too big to where you don't see what you're trying to show. Well, you don't want your audience to not be able to see what you're trying to show. Next, we have creating indecipherable graphs. This does go hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier. You want to make sure charts and graphs have statistics that are readable. You want to make sure that you don't have clashing colors that just make it painful to look at. And definitely don't be using blurry photos. You need to be very careful when you're changing resolutions on photos and when you're using them on your PowerPoint. You don't want the text to become blurry. So, I mean, the general idea with that is you want a higher resolution, you don't want lower resolutions, I guess. Okay. Moving on from there, we have the last monster, which is distracting with animations. And if you're having flashy or slow transitions, this definitely goes hand in hand. A big time where we see this is in ads online. If you're on the computer and you're on a website, the ad has these flashing or like crazy transitions and animations. That's because it's trying to pull your attention away. Just like how if you have some flashy transition, it'll pull your attention away from what you're trying to speak about. So we're certainly not trying to pull our attention away from what we're speaking about, so we don't want to have these. So next, we will have a short activity, and we will be talking about which graphic fits best here. So The Birds is a movie, and it's about a town that is attacked by swarms of violent birds. So here we have a few pictures of birds, but we're not really sure which is the best for our movie here. So if I could just get some volunteer to maybe suggest a picture and then give a reason why. Do you have a volunteer? Sure.
I think the first picture.
So he thinks the first picture. Why would that be?
There's a bunch of birds all over her head.
Yeah, there does appear to be.
The kids are freaked out.
Right. We have birds, we have people freaking out. That's about all we could ask for. Can I have a volunteer tell me why the second picture might not be the best to use? Sure. Oh.
Because only birds, so I'm supposed to see many birds, not
Right.
just one.
So she said that she's supposed to see multiple birds, and there's only the one there. So it wouldn't really translate with the idea of multiple swarms of violent birds. And now for our last picture, who we probably know what this is from, yes?
Yeah, well, it is Angry Birds, but also, like, the biggest bird is also scared, so it doesn't really work because what should be the most frightening bird is actually the most scared bird.
Right. This bird being confident in itself is just the wrong message to send. Moving on.
Strong is best.
He's doing well. All right. Now to Bradley, who will be looking at editing your efforts.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we're on the last recommendation now, and I know some of you may be zoning out, but just stick with me for a few more minutes, and we have an activity, and we'll wrap it up. Our fifth recommendation is edit your efforts. The first hero will be improve your visual effects. Now, you can use visual effects to the best of your advantage by utilizing your graphics in your color to point directly where your audience wants to focus at. And in the weapon, you can highlight these points with your graphics. So your graphics, they just point directly at what your audience should be focusing on. The second hero is reviewing for clear structure. So every great presentation has a hierarchy. They have slides intermittently that will point directly back to the main message that you're trying to present to your audience. For example, this one uses a tracker, but you can also use your title slide or your schema to point back to the main message so your audience doesn't lose focus. The third hero would be to check for your editing mistakes. And the weapon used here is just to proofread constantly. It's a brute force method. You have to go over and over again your presentation because there's nothing more embarrassing than having an editing mistake on your presentation. And number four, the hero is the verify that your graphics will work. So like Jonathan mentioned earlier, when you're scaling and you're resizing your pictures, you want to go back and check to make sure that nothing is blurry, nothing's out of contrast, and everything looks good on the big screen. So that when you're presenting, everything is to scale. And if you have a chance to have access to your big screen, then do so before your presentation to make sure everything aligns. Now we're going to move on to the monsters and traps. First monster is cluttering your charts, and this is called chart junk, and it's where you add in all this unnecessary, unvaluable information to your charts and graphics that doesn't tell your reader anything, doesn't tell your audience anything, doesn't add value. And so the trap is including unnecessary design as well. You can use your pictures in places where they just shouldn't be. It's distracting from the actual data that you're trying to pass on to your audience. Second monster will be including false information. And this isn't just including 20 instead of 10, some data mistake. This is also leading into false information with using 3D graphs instead of 2D graphs. You can mislead people by using 3D graphs typically because it scales differently and can mislead people into the data you're actually trying to provide. And I'll show you an example here shortly of what I mean. Assuming your data is accurate is sometimes you're in a coworker situation, you're in a team, you're working with people who they're collecting data, we're all compiling and working together to work on a project. You want to trust your coworkers, but also verify their information is also accurate. Relying on spell check and leaving typos and errors in. So this is an obvious one. Typos are very, very distracting, and people can see them instantly. People often rely and fall into the trap on relying on their spell check. And I actually did this one time when I was in a texting conversation with my boss, and we were talking about a presentation he was doing. And at the end of the conversation, I meant to say, good luck on your presentation, but it auto-corrected to good luck on your pregnancy. And it was it was pretty scary because his wife was pregnant at the time, and he was like, how do you even know about that? And so it was really scary at the time, and everything's okay. Beautiful baby girl, everything, but the point is, don't rely on that spell check. Go back and do some checking of your own. Including and excluding your document sources. So you don't want to get caught for plagiarism, obviously. And a simple way of doing that is just as you're going through collecting your information, just make sure that you're citing as you go. Because some people, they forget to cite as they go. And you'll end up with bad citations. So behind me is a slide, and this is two pictures, both from the movie Jaws, one from the original, one from the sequel. In 1975, this movie, Jaws, won an award for Best Editing. And you can see how the camera angles and the editors used it to their advantage to portray an actual shark attack. Whereas in the second movie, Jaws, the editors didn't do such a good job at editing their efforts. You can see the hydraulics and mechanisms inside the shark, which disillusions the audience and distracts from the main message. Next, we'll move into our activity. I'm going to need 3 volunteers, but I'll describe what this is first. It's a graph that represents the top 5 horror films by box office sales. And I made this graph on Excel, but it has lots of room for improvement. So I'll need 3 volunteers to give me an example of what this graph could improve on based on what I just presented. Anybody? Yes?
I think Blair is misspelled, but also the graph part. I can't tell which one is the biggest, just at first glance. I think if I investigated it pretty deeply, I could figure out which one was the most, but it's confusing at first glance.
Exactly. So you notice immediately the spelling error and also the 3D graph part and how it was misleading. Anybody else? Another example? Yes?
I don't like the placement.
Placement?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the placement is very confusing because you have all these different layers here. You don't know what to focus in. Yes?
I think in this case, because you don't have that many, you could use a circle chart with percentage. It would display.
Right, so another graph option to display the information might be better, yes?
I know you only wanted 3, but also having 2018 be like the last thing up there makes it a little just like...
Why didn't you try harder?
I feel like you did it intentionally though, so I think you were just trying to catch us off guard.
Right, so this example includes many room errors errors that could use improvement. One more?
Yeah, and then the color, the first bar and the last one, the colors are pretty close. So maybe I would suggest like maybe a green color to make it different.
Right. Yeah, the coloring would make a difference. So I posted the 3 top errors using the 3D graph, including a legend in here and including the typo. So the next part of the activity will just be an example to show you a better version to display the same information. See how it's clean. It uses 2D graph, hides the grid lines, uses horizontal text only, and the legends are removed. You can obviously see that the movie It had the highest box office sales.